throughout the nearly 500-year history of the Roman Republic and the nearly 300-year history of Roman coinage, they portrayed many different values on their coins, and I think it says a lot about what the societies valued at the time. So, for instance, we can look at some of these really early Republican-era coins. They only started minting their own coins in 211 when they adopted this denarius system. Before then, they were predominantly relying on the Greek status system. But when you look at these coins here, for example, this RC55, which was minted in 211 BC during the peak of the Punic War, the obverse of the coin depicts Roma, and the reverse of the coin depicts Dioscuri, which are these sort of mythological images of victory, sort of derived from the Spartan royal lineage. Or if we look at this other coin at the bottom here, RCC 122, that which was minted between 206 and 195 BC, the obverse of the coin depicts images of Hercules and strength, and the reverse of the coin depicts imageries of a boat and a dog, right? So not particularly personified images of power or victory, but instead more abstract images of victory, the success of Rome, commerce, and dogs. This tendency to uphold sort of traditional Roman virtues on coinage and sort of to limit the minting of coinage to those values holds up for the vast majority of Roman history. Only in 198 BC was the first ever image of an actual person minted on a coin, and following that, it didn't occur again for almost 100 years. Only towards the end of the Republican period do we see a massive uptick in the minting of, like, images of people on coinage. The interesting statistic here, between 326 BC and 52 BC, only 0.4% of all dies used to mint Roman coins contained an image of an actual person. Contrast this to post-52 BC, so 52 to the Battle of Actium, a whole 35% of dies used to mint coinage contain imagery of actual people. So something fundamentally went awry between about 100 BC and 52 BC. So what I did was I went and I took this frequency chart of the percentage of Roman dies used to mint a coin each year, which contained the image of an actual person, and plotted it against the year it was minted. And as you can see here, it's relatively easy to block out specific, intense periods of struggle for the Republic against the chart. So you can see the Second Punic War contextualizes that very first instance, the civil wars of Sulla, the Third Servile War, the civil wars of Caesar and Octavian. All of these periods are sort of bookended or themselves contain periods of minting of, like, actual people on coinage. So the first instance of them actually minting the image of somebody's face on a Roman coin was Titus Quintius Flaminius during the Second Macedonian War. He was this relatively minor figure during the Second Punic War who wound up sort of surviving and making his way up the ranks to consul and sort of beat back Philip of Macedon and established the larger Roman presence in Greece. Now, what's really interesting is after doing this, he minted these stata, which is interesting because Rome didn't mint stata anymore. This was, like, completely anachronistic. And these weren't even minted in Rome. They were minted in Greece. And he very much modeled the issuing of these coins off of the stata which Alexander issued during his reign. Gold coins with an image of Alexander on the obverse and an image of Nike, the god of victory, on the on the reverse. Now, Titus did the same thing and minted an image of himself on the front and Nike on the reverse. This is, like, incredibly anachronistic, and I think goes to show the degree to which sort of Roman political norms had degraded during the Second Punic War, because there wouldn't be an image of an actual person minted on a coin in Rome who was, like, a contemporary for 120 years in the future, and they hadn't minted stata for almost 20 years. So kind of keep this in mind when we're examining the other uses of propaganda in Roman coinage, and remember that this, like, really weird thing happened 100 years beforehand, and that it, like, wasn't unprecedented, but it was still deeply bizarre. And that sort of brings us to the meat and potatoes of this presentation, which is the coins which are minted during the Social War. This is when you really start to see the bulk of coins being minted with, like, specific historical reference for a propagandistic purpose. So the very first coins which were issued with somebody's face on it after the Flaminius coins were these coins that were issued by this dude L. Titurius Sabinus, where on the obverse of the coin there is an image of King Titus Tatius, and on the reverse of the image is a depiction of the rape of the Sabine women. There are two really interesting pieces of context to this artifact. The first is that L. Titurius Sabinus was ostensibly an optimates. He served under Pompey during the Servile War, and for all intents and purposes would have had his interest aligned with the anti-Marian faction. The second interesting piece of context is that the selection of the rape of the Sabine women as a piece of imagery is ostensibly a pro-Marian piece of imagery. The idea that non-Romans who live in Rome are deserving of specific rights and treatments is exactly the kind of ideology that Marius was fighting for, and which the Solon and Optimates faction was fighting against. So it's interesting to consider that there may have been some sort of dissent within the Optimates faction during the social wars, which would provide a really interesting sort of contrast to the total alignment under Sulla, which we see during the dictatorship. We see a similar sort of pro-populares set of imagery being used the following year in 88 BC under C. Marcius Censorinus, but it's not as specifically addressing the political grievances which were occurring at Rome at the time. It contains images of Numa Pompilius and Ancius Marcius, who are the supposed ancestors of Gaius Marius, but it does not itself contain images which directly allude to the ongoing conflicts in the Sabine Wars or the increasing political radicalization that was occurring within the Optimates faction. So this one is less specifically relevant to ongoing political struggles in Rome, and it's interesting to consider if this one is an actual conflict with the coins of Sabinus, or if it's a sort of confirmation of his ideology, but more explicitly oriented around contemporary Roman political figures. The next instance of political figures being placed on Roman coinage occurs in 71 BC during the Servile Wars, or specifically the Third Servile War. It was a major slave revolt in the south of Italy led by Spartacus, who you may know from the Hulu TV show. It was about 100,000 slaves who defeated a consular army the year prior, which resulted in Crassus and Pompey sort of banding together several legions, going to the south of Italy and defeating the slave revolt. Now, this was predominantly done by Crassus. Pompey left the battlefield early to go back to Rome, persecute some sort of vague remnants of the slave army, but mainly in order to establish his political credibility as the one who defeated the slave revolt. He minted these coins with the word Magnus on them, meaning the great, and an image of the triumph on the reverse of the coin. The minting of these coins was particularly concerning, first of all, because Pompey had an active army sitting outside of Rome at the time, and second of all, because the year following this, he would stand for election as consul, even though he wasn't technically eligible, but because he had, several legions sitting outside of Rome, he won the election handily. The abuse of the sort of Roman political process didn't go unnoted, however, as we meet our second Sabinus, T. Vettius Sabinus. On the obverse of the coin, we again see an image of King Titus Tatius, and on the reverse of the coin, we see a farmer, we can tell he's a farmer because there's a little stalk of grain there, running some workhorses. The imagery selected here is, of course, of note because King Titus Tatius would have been sort of viewable as an advocate or a historical figure who sort of represents these non-Roman Italians and lower class Romans. And the reverse of the image is just even more specific, right? The idea of a farmer being minted on Roman coinage. And this just, again, I mean, from all the historical evidence we have, the Sabinuses were ostensibly Optimates. So this once again just kind of demonstrates there was a lot of conflict within the Optimates faction, and not everybody was on board with sort of the Sullas and the Pompeys within the faction. And furthermore, that Pompey, despite his extreme political power at the time, wasn't able to effectively stop the minting of coins like these. Following the Servile War, there wasn't the minting of coins with historical figures or contemporary figures' faces on it, really until the Civil War. There were some coins which are issued by the senatorial faction, but the one which I'm going to examine here is the C. Coelius Claudius coin. It was minted by his own grandson. Coelius Claudius was sort of this very Gracchian figure, early popularis figure in the history of the Republic. His big contribution was the Lex Turbilia, which made votes to convict somebody for treason secret ballots, and was a very popular early popularis position. It was seen as so radical at the time that Cicero said, in a matter that concerned the safety of the Optimates, they dreaded the impetuosity of the masses and their license afforded by the ballot. And while this coin itself doesn't depict it, Kind of it does, but there were other coins of the same issuance where the reverse of the coin contained images of temples to Sol Invictus, giving a sort of religious justification and religious sort of fervor to the prosecution of the senatorial faction by Caesar. It is of extreme note that during the entire conflict of the senatorial civil wars, Caesar never once issued a coin with an image of his own face on it. That is until the year of his assassination, where they start minting these silver coins in 44 BC, where on the obverse of the coin is an image of Caesar, and on the reverse of the coin is an image of Venus. And this is a complete breaking with the political norms in Roman history. We've seen coins minted with allusions to virtues and allusions to Rome and triumph and victory, but never before have we seen on the coinage a direct comparison between Roman political figures and deities. And following 44 BC, this becomes the complete standard. Every character and faction within the civil wars just starts calling themselves some type of deity. And so by observing this long arc of transition from specific political critique from the perspective of like ideology to comparing specific contemporary political figures to specific ideological positions and victory, to comparing the political ideologies to God and the final transmutation, the association of specific contemporary political figures with deities, we can see the complete erosion of the Roman Republic entirely documented in its coinage. And I think that's pretty neat. Here are the citations.